This is a 2019 Ford GT, and it is an insane supercar. It has 647 horsepower, 550 pound-feet of torque. It'll do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, then hit a top speed of 216 miles an hour. Now, those numbers sound like the stuff of an Italian supercar, but this is North America's supercar, designed by Ford in Michigan, built in Canada with a sticker price of around $600,000 with options. And today, I'm going to review it. Now, you may remember that I've already reviewed the new Ford GT, but it was a while ago, more than 2 years ago, back before I got as in-depth as I do now, before 4K videos, and I didn't really have all that much time with the car. So today I've borrowed this new Ford GT from my friend KARL BRAUER, who just got it. You can check out his Instagram and his website by clicking the link in the description below. He's already posted some cool photos with it since he's driving his Ford GT. So let's go through the basics. The new Ford GT uses a turbocharged V6. Yes, just a V6, joining the ranks of some other exotic cars with 6-cylinder engines like the Ferrari Dino, the Jaguar XJ220, the Porsche 911 and 911 Turbo, the old Acura NSX, and the new Acura NSX. But the Ford GT stands above them all with those numbers, which bear repeating: 647 horsepower, 550 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, a top speed of 216 miles an hour, and a sticker price of around $500,000 before options. Those are crazy numbers, and the Ford GT is a crazy car. Now, Ford says they will build 1,350 of these, which is about the same production run as the Ferrari F40 and the Porsche Carrera GT. Interestingly, a lot of people who applied to buy one of these were simply rejected. Ford chose people who it wanted to buy their GT supercar based on whether Ford thought the people would actually use it and drive it and enjoy it, and not just sock it away in a collection. So today I'm going to do just that. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the new Ford GT and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to update the Doug score from the last time I reviewed it if it needs any updating. And for more of my thoughts on the GT, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of the cheapest mid-engine cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the GT with the key, which actually is just a regular Ford key on the front with your normal buttons. You turn it over and it says GT on it. But on the front side, you have all the regular buttons, including a trunk button, just like you would have to open the trunk in your Ford Taurus. You press it twice and then the trunk unlatches, and then you can get back here and open it up, and then you have access to your Ford GT storage compartment. Although it isn't just the trunk and storage compartment that the key opens, it's all one big area that also contains the engine. But let's start with the trunk. This here, what you see, is the only trunk you get in the new Ford GT. It is probably the smallest trunk in the entire car industry, incredibly tiny. This is all the storage you have in this car, so don't expect to be taking it on any long trips. You can see there are a couple of little loops inside the trunk, and that's because when this car is sold new, it comes with a little case in there that also contains like tire sealant, battery charger, typical stuff that comes in a new car. But that is all the trunk you get. Now, next up, I want to talk about closing the trunk lid, which is a bit of an unusual process because the latch that keeps it closed isn't at the base or the very far back point. Instead, it's kind of in the middle, as you can see when you go to put it down. But when you do put it down, that means that you don't push at the very far back to close it. Instead, you have to push in the middle to make sure it's closed. KARL recommends using some cloth. You push down, and now it is latched closed. And that's how you close the cargo compartment and engine cover in a Ford GT. Now obviously I'm not done in that area yet because I haven't covered the engine yet, so I have to open it back up. But before I do, I want to talk about the secret way to open up the cargo cover, engine cover in the Ford GT. You can do it from the key fob, or there's a button inside the cabin that'll open it, but it's all electronic. If you want to open it manually, there is a hidden little keyhole underneath this rear bumper area next to the license plate. You kind of have to look under there, look up, and you can see there is a hidden keyhole on the Ford GT. If you separate the key from the key fob, go under there, stick the key in and twist it, that will manually open the engine compartment in case the battery is dead and the electronic stuff won't work. But anyway, moving back under this cover, I want to talk about the engine for a second. And I want to start with the quirks and features that you can see, starting with the fact that it says EcoBoost on it, very proudly, very middle of the engine, reminding everyone that this is from Ford's EcoBoost family of engines. It also says powered by Ford on the sides, which is like a nice old school touch from older Ford models. You can also see that the oil cap back there says GT on it. All of these things combine for some very cool elements in the engine compartment. Now, since I have this open and we're talking about the engine, a lot of people are asking, why doesn't this car have a V8 or a V10 or a V12 like most other supercars? One reason obviously is Ford makes these EcoBoost V6s and they wanted to give it a little bit of credibility, but it also comes down to size. If you look at the car from the back, you can see it has this teardrop shape that starts in the front and then sort of comes to a point in the back. Ford knew exactly how big they wanted this body to be, and they knew that it would be a lot easier to fit a 6-cylinder engine in there than a larger V8. So that's one of the reasons why this car has a V6 instead of a V8. Now, the theory on the teardrop shape is that sort of the front of the car kind of pushes a hole in the air and the rest of it sort of glides through it. It's all about aerodynamics, which is a bit of a theme on the outside of this car. And indeed, the biggest place where you can see the theme of aerodynamics in this car is your angle right now, because you can see into this car's most distinctive design trait, and that would be these flying buttresses. In order to channel air how Ford wanted it throughout the exterior of this car, they actually have these giant holes on the sides of the car where air passes right through these giant panels right here. And it doesn't just stop there. In the back, air also passes below the wing and just continues these big channels of air down the side of the car, which is all about aerodynamics and airflow. That was a really big factor in designing this car. And on the subject of these flying buttresses here, this isn't just a panel, it's actually functional. Air comes in through this giant air intake on the side of this car, and then inside the flying buttress there are ducts that bring air into the engine to cool it down, which is a very impressive component. So not only is this big hole in the side of the car functional for aerodynamics and airflow, but you also have this panel going over the hole that has a duct inside it that is functionally bringing air into the engine. Now, another important aerodynamic component of this car is the rear wing. Right now it's in the down position, so the whole car is like flat and slippery, but it also goes up, and there are several different situations in which it goes up. One is if you hit a certain speed in any drive mode, the wing will go up, and if you slow down at a certain speed, it will go back down. But the wing will also go up if you put the car into track mode, into the track driving mode. Switch into track mode, and the wing goes up and back rather quickly, so it's ready for racetrack use and produces as much downforce as possible. Now, interestingly, if you switch out of track mode, the wing doesn't go back down. Ford thinks that is like a pinching hazard. You could have your hand in here, someone could switch out of track mode, and then you get your fingers chopped off. So instead, you switch out of track mode, and then you have to drive for a few feet up to 15 miles an hour, and then the wing will go back down, which is kind of a funny little touch. Now, another interesting thing that happens when you switch into track mode, probably the most interesting thing, is that the car lowers itself. Indeed, you switch into track mode and the car lowers by 2 inches in order to be as low to the ground as possible for the best possible track performance. And it doesn't just lower gradually, it does it instantaneously. Now, when you've switched into track mode and the car has lowered, it is only 41.5 inches high at its highest point, which is a truly unbelievable number. It's really, really low. Now next we move around to the back of the new Ford GT, which has a few quirks and features of its own, starting with the brake lights. The brake lights are these big circles, which looks cool, but also they have an additional functional component. In the middle of the brake lights there is a hole, and through that hole hot air is dissipated from the engine. So the engine gets hot, it sends hot air out the hole in the middle of the brake lights, which is really cool. Now obviously the brake lights aren't the only circles back here. You also have the exhausts, and I always love cars that prioritize the exhaust above the license plate, and this is one of those cars. Now given that this car has a V6 engine, a lot of people are questioning, does this thing still sound good like a V8 or a V12? I personally think it sounds fantastic. Take a listen. Next up, another interesting item around the back is this stripe. You can see there's this black stripe that goes down the middle of this particular car. That's because this car is a Ford GT from the Carbon series, which is a new option for the 2019 model year. It is a $70,000 option and is designed to make the car a little bit lighter and thus a little bit better on the track. And the stripe is my favorite part because basically it's just the rest of the car unpainted. That's what this car looks like underneath all the paint. They left that middle bit unpainted, and so it looks like you have stripes when really it's just that the rest of the car has paint. Which is a cool idea. Now obviously for $70,000, the Carbon series option includes more than just those painted stripes. You also get a bunch more stuff. For example, this back panel is carbon fiber, you can see. You also have a side panel, it's carbon fiber down the side of the car, same thing in front, more carbon fiber. You also get carbon fiber wheels, which save an impressive amount of weight, and you get titanium lug nuts, which also save a little bit of weight. But while most of those options with the Carbon series car can be ordered as regular options on the standard Ford GT, there are a few options that are distinctive to only the Carbon series models. One of them is the stripe, which I already mentioned. There's also the carbon fiber A-pillar, only on the Carbon series cars. But probably the most important component is the clear engine cover. In other Ford GT models, it's glass, but in the Carbon series car, it is a polycarbonate in order to save weight. Now, speaking of that clear engine cover, you will notice there are holes in it, which KARL, the owner, told me is kind of annoying if you're trying to wash the car, because then water goes into the engine, creates water spots, and it ends up looking dirty. Something you have to keep in mind if you're washing your Ford GT. Now, next we move on to putting fuel in the new Ford GT, which isn't exactly the easiest thing you can do. The fuel filler is here, underneath the flying buttress. You push it on the back, it pops open, and then you just kind of tilt it, and that's where you put in fuel. It's an odd location because you're basically putting fuel over like 10 inches of bodywork and this air intake. You really don't want to mess up and accidentally dribble some fuel down. It's not exactly the easiest or most convenient spot for that fuel filler. Now, another interesting item over here is this little black panel next to the front door. I say it's interesting because when you lock the car, it shows an image of a lock that is locked. When you unlock the car, it still shows that lock, but now part of the top is missing, so now it looks like it's unlocked, and you can kind of play with it. Lock, unlock, and you can see how that little graphic changes as you mess with the locks. I like that idea, it's really cool. Now next we move up to the front of the new GT, where you have one of the most distinctive lighting assemblies in the entire car business. It's this large flat piece that contains the headlights. It's so big and such a focal point that Ford even put a rather large GT logo in there just because they knew people would be checking out the headlights, and they are very much worth checking out. I especially like how the turn signals work. When the signals are on, you can see the outer strip of lights in the lighting assembly is the turn signal, and the inner one is the running light. When you turn the turn signal off, the signal goes away and that outer strip becomes an additional running light, which gives this car a very distinctive look when it's driving down the road. Now, next up, it's time to get into the Ford GT. And when you walk up to it to get in, it's not exactly the most obvious thing what you do, since there isn't a door handle on the door itself. What you do is you stick your fingers into this little blue panel next to the door, and by pushing your fingers in there, that electronically pops the door open a little bit. From there, you just kind of reach onto the door and open it up the rest of the way. It's actually a pretty good system, relatively intuitive, and I like how it works. Now, with the door up like this, a couple of interesting things in the door sill area. One is the fact that you can see this like door assembly area in there with the hinge. You can't see that on a lot of cars, and I think it looks really, really cool in this one. But the more important thing, moving further down, you can see that the Ford GT also acts as a street sweeper. It picks up an enormous amount of road debris in this little area behind the front wheel, which is rather interesting. Now, in Ford GTs, when they come from the factory, there's no screen here. And so all of this road debris comes into this area and then kind of like blows down the doors. And KARL, the owner of this car, told me a lot of the early ones were kind of getting scratched up until someone in the aftermarket made a screen you can put here to keep this stuff from scratching up your doors. When it gets full of road debris and other grime, you just kind of pop off the screen, clean it, put the screen back on, and you're back ready to go. Now, before I climb inside the car and go over the interior quirks and features, I want to mention one other item, and that is in the driver's footwell area, there is a little latch. If you pull that latch, it opens up the front compartment in the Ford GT. So what exactly is in the front compartment in the Ford GT? Well, it isn't more storage. I told you that rear trunk is the only exterior storage you get. Instead, it's a little compartment. You prop it open with a prop, and then you can see under here that there's just some service stuff. You have washer fluid, you have steering fluid, and a few other things, but you won't be able to store anything up here. This isn't an additional storage compartment. And in fact, I suspect most Ford GT owners will probably not open this very much. When you're done with it, just kind of put it back down, push it, and it's latched. Now, once you're inside the new Ford GT, closing the doors is fairly easy. There's this piece that juts out on the door panel, covered in Alcantara. You just pull on that. It's surprisingly sturdy, and then the doors close, just like normal car doors, except, you know, from above. Now, one of the first things you notice when you climb into the Ford GT is the fact that there is no storage in this car. And I don't mean there is some storage, just not all that much. I mean there is no storage. There's no glove box, there's no door panel storage, there's no net between the seats. There's nothing. Now, the regular Ford GT has like little cup holders that you can get, and there's a little tiny storage pocket at the base of the driver's seat, but not in the Carbon series model. To save weight, they eliminated the little storage pocket, saving like 0.3 ounces, and they eliminated the cup holders. So you have literally zero storage in the interior of this car. The only spot you can put stuff is at the very front of the center console. There's this tiny little unused area where you can stick stuff if you absolutely have to. That's it, that's all. No other storage in this car. Not very practical. Now, another thing that you notice the moment you climb into a Ford GT, especially if you climb in with a passenger, is just how tight it is in this interior. Tighter, close quarters than almost any other supercar, and that has to do with that teardrop shape. Again, Ford wanted like the frontmost part of the car to plow through the air and everything else to kind of taper off and back. So the interior of this car is only as wide as it absolutely needs to be to seat two people. It's incredible how narrow it is. In fact, I can reach over and touch my camera filming me, which is something I've never been able to do in any other car I have ever filmed from the opposite side. It's that narrow. And speaking of the seats in this car, another thing you notice right when you climb in is the fact that the driver's seat doesn't move. There are no controls for it, no adjustments. You can't move it at all. Now, the reason Ford did this is they wanted the cabin to be only a certain size and be able to pull the windshield back as far as possible, again, for aerodynamics. And if you allow the seat to move forward, you have to make the cabin bigger in order to do so. They didn't want that, so the seat is fixed in place. But what if you don't fit? Well, of course, Ford thought about that, so you can move the steering wheel and the pedals. You can see there are two little latches on the base of the steering wheel for tilting and telescoping. You can move it around. And there's also this little nylon cord you can pull in the driver's footwell area that will move the pedals forward, and then you can use your feet to kind of position them exactly where you want. There is actually a reasonable amount of room in this car, even for tall drivers, but you don't access that room by moving the seat around. Instead, you move the wheel and the pedals. One other interesting item in this car, you can see it has seat belts, which isn't really all that surprising at all. But you can also see behind the seats, there are these little bars. Those are attachment points for a racing harness. And KARL, the owner of this car, told me they're optional and you can't add them after the fact. You have to specify it when you order the car or else they can't be added. So most Ford GT owners are getting them just in case. Now, the next thing you notice when you climb in this car, when you go to start driving it, is the steering wheel, which is probably the most interesting and unique steering wheel in the entire car business. We will start with the fact that it is not a wheel at all. It is not circular. The top and the bottom are completely flat, just like in a race car, which is rather interesting to see in a road car. But even more interesting to see in a road car is all of the buttons on the steering wheel. Almost every major control in this car has been placed on the steering wheel. The theory being that if you're on the racetrack, you don't want to move your hands off to turn on the wipers or adjust something. So everything is right at your fingertips. On the right side, at the top, you have the windshield washers. Then below that, you have the wipers themselves. Next, you have the right turn signal. Then you have some controls for the sync system, the Bluetooth. And then at the bottom, you have the stereo volume. You can turn it up or down with 2 separate buttons. Now over on the left, you have a button that flashes the brights. Then next you have the drive mode selector button. Below that you have the left turn signal. And below that there is the cruise control. Yes, this car has cruise control. And then finally you have the next track and previous track buttons for the stereo. A lot of stuff is on this steering wheel. Obviously behind all that, you have these very cool silver paddle shifters, which are a neat little touch that also make you feel like you're driving a race car. Now, one interesting item with the steering wheel, KARL, the car's owner, told me that his biggest complaint with the entire car is the turn signal buttons mounted on the steering wheel. Not that they're there, because that's actually a pretty intuitive place for them, but that they're in the middle of everything else. So sometimes you go to turn on the turn signal and you accidentally press a little too high and you turn on the washer fluid or the brights. It's just a little difficult to keep track of. It would be nice if those turn signal buttons were placed somewhere else so you didn't accidentally turn on something else when you were going for the turn signals. Now, one other item worth noting on the steering wheel is this little dial over on the right side that says OK with arrows pointing up or down. If you actually move that dial, it adjusts the gauge cluster. There is a gauge cluster screen, and when you move the dial, it shows you various different vehicle things like your trip odometer, your tire pressures, that sort of thing every time you move the dial. Now, speaking of the gauge cluster, this car has one of the great gauge clusters in the car industry. It is just one big screen, and it is very cool to adjust. And what I mean by that is if you start in wet or comfort mode, the gauge cluster looks a certain way with the speed displayed right in the middle. But if you move to sport mode, the speed kind of goes off to the side, and instead your gear is displayed right in the middle, since that's the most important thing. If you're on a racetrack, you don't really care how fast you're going. Now, if you switch the car into track mode, the gauge cluster will change itself once again, and it's very cool to see it reorganizing. And now your gear and your RPMs are by far the biggest focal point, with speed a very small afterthought in the corner. It is very interesting to see how it changes as you change between the different drive modes in the Ford GT. And by the way, one other interesting item worth noting about the gauge cluster is that it displays a very charming graphic of the Ford GT. If you have, for instance, a door open, it will let you know with this little Ford GT graphic in the corner, perfectly designed to mimic the actual look of the car, which I absolutely love. It will also let you know if the axle lifter is raised. That graphic will show the GT with the front end up. And speaking of the axle lifter, I guess we then move into the center console, where you have a row of buttons, dials that are worth mentioning, starting with that axle lifter. It's the furthest one on the back. You press it and the front end of the car lifts up to clear like low curbs or driveways. A lot of exotic cars have that, but the impressive thing here is just how fast it happens. Push it and instantly the front end is lifted. Now compare this to a lot of other supercars where you realize you're about to go into a driveway, and then you have to go into the screen and cycle through some menus, and then it takes like 10 seconds to lift the front of the car up. Not this thing. The moment you see the driveway, push the button and you're up, and you'll clear it, which is pretty cool. And it's the same thing coming down. Now the other buttons in the center console are also worth mentioning. Right above the axle lifter, you have the comfort suspension button. If you press it, it puts the car in comfort mode. It seems ridiculous in a car like this, but hey, it's there. Above that, you have the traction control off button. And then above that, you have the hazard lights, 4 buttons arranged in a row. Now the next thing up is the transmission selector, which is a dial in this car, rather unusual. You have P, R, and D all arranged in kind of a circle, and you just twist it to go between gears. In the middle, there's a button marked M. That's to put the transmission in manual mode. Now next up in the center console, above the transmission dial, you have obviously the engine start-stop button. You push that if you want to turn on your Ford GT. Now, next up, moving elsewhere in the Ford GT interior, I want to move to the left of the steering wheel, where you will see some buttons and dials over there. The button on the far left, that pops the trunk open from the interior. So you press that, and then the trunk engine cover lid thing opens up. You also have a dial there, and that is the headlights, and that's just a Ford parts bin piece. You will have that same headlight dial in the Explorer and the Taurus, in basically every other Ford, and also in a $600,000 supercar. Now, interestingly, that is not the only Ford parts bin piece in this car shared with other Ford models. You'll also see that the door lock and unlock buttons are just regular lock and unlock buttons from a Ford. Same deal with the power mirror control. They just come off of other Ford models. And it's the same deal with the power window switches. Again, they're just borrowed from the Mustang and the Focus and basically all of the other Fords in a $600,000 supercar. Now, the most interesting one is the door release button. These are electronic release doors, and so obviously that is going to be unique. You press this little button and then the doors open right up. But something I realized, that button actually isn't unique. It's the same button that releases the electronic doors in the Lincoln Continental, so that car shares something with the GT as well. And speaking of the doors, one other interesting item with them is that they contain the interior's only climate control vents. There are no center climate vents in this car. Instead, you have just 4, 2 on the driver's door, 2 on the passenger door, which is a little bit odd. When you turn on the climate control, you get nothing blown on you from the middle. Everything comes from the door area because this interior just isn't wide enough for vents in the center. Instead, they integrated them into the doors, which is actually a pretty good idea. Other interesting items in this interior, one is the incredibly tiny sun visors. You can see they flip sort of the opposite direction of a normal car sun visor, and they're just really small and little, but they're there. Another interesting component of the interior of this car is that this panel on the dashboard is not just a panel they stick here for the dashboard, it's actually a structural component in this car, which is very, very interesting, very different and unusual compared to normal cars that just have sort of a plastic dash tacked on. In this car, it's structural. And you can see above this panel, which is finished in Alcantara, there's a hole. And you can kind of stick your hand in it, and if you're flexible enough, you might even be able to reach all the way to the windshield via the hole in your Ford GT dashboard. Now, speaking of the dashboard, another interesting item with the dashboard, over on the right, you can see you have the American flag, then it says GT, and then it says K043. Now, K is this car's model year based on the VIN. The VIN contains a little code for the model year, and K means 2019. 043 is this car's actual production number within 2019. So what that basically says is this is car number 043 for model year 2019, and all of the Ford GTs have that. Now, next up, we move on to the center of the Ford GT situation, where you will find 2 surprisingly normal items. There's the climate control, which is rather normal, very easy to just adjust. It's simple, like a normal car climate control. The only interesting thing is that the recirculating air button has an image of a Ford GT on it and not a regular car. And you also have the infotainment system, which is just Ford's Sync infotainment system, except on a smaller screen to account for the smaller interior of this car. Now, this screen is not particularly interesting or entertaining in the grand scheme of the Ford GT. It's basically just Ford Sync. It's relatively responsive to your touch. It has navigation capabilities. It has a valet mode. It allows you to sync your phone with Bluetooth. Nothing particularly interesting or weird there. Maybe the only part of the car that doesn't have any real quirks and features. And so those are the quirks and features of the new Ford GT. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive it. All right, driving the new GT. This is Carl, the owner of the car. Are you scared? No. Not at all. I haven't crashed anything yet. Doug's driving my car. First impression, just getting in and everything, I mean, it's such an event. The doors, it's so narrow in here. You know, the car doesn't look narrow, but the cabin is very narrow because of the arrow on the side. You know, you get into a McLaren, they're all about the same. Ferraris are all about the same. This is like no other exotic car because Ford doesn't make any. So everything is kind of like bespoke and weird, and the steering wheel is weird, and the paddles are weird, and it's a different experience.
Everything from the outside to the inside of the car is unconventional. I think that's one of the reasons that it's so desirable and people like it, because they do feel like there's nothing else on the road like it.
Last time we were together driving this car in Utah 2 years ago, I never felt the V6 was a drawback. How have you've put 700 miles on this car already, how have you felt about it?
It's something that you have to think about, because if you just drive the car, it's fast, and, and it makes a neat noise. So unless you get caught up in thinking about the fact that it doesn't have a V8, you'll never care that it doesn't have a V8.
I remember at the time, 2 years ago, you told me that it's down to a theory at that point. It's a matter of theory.
Right.
Should a car like this have a whatever V12, V8?
Right. And of course, I always feel like, you know, well, there's a whole lot of cars out there with a certain crest on it that have 6 cylinders in them that nobody questions at all, right?
It honestly feels like a V8 in the sense of the immediacy of the power. Because one of the things I love about V8s is just how responsive they are to the throttle.
Yeah.
And this feels like, there are a couple of good V6s on the market right now that feel like that.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. Yeah, the signals on the thing are weird. So if you just tap it, it only goes 3 times?
Right. Although,
but what if you hold it down or something? It goes longer.
See, now sometimes if you tap it, it goes 3 times. I've kind of got it down. There's a certain level of tap that gets you three signals, and another level of tap that just keeps it going. And that
you just have to kind of know. Man, listen to that sound. That's one of the things that I really realized, because even I was skeptical about the 6-cylinder when I heard about it, etc. But the thing that I saw in Utah when I saw him on the track going fast was that it actually sounds great. It doesn't matter. And that was the thing. And I've so many people have told me over the last, year or two, oh, that GT, it's only got a 6-cylinder. And I keep telling people, no, it's amazing. It sounds great. It feels great. It doesn't feel like a 6-cylinder.
Well, and there are people out there who are like, it doesn't sound good either, or it sounds like a 6, and it's like, no, you're just deciding.
Yeah, because you know
it's got
a 6,
right? So you decided you don't like the exhaust note. Again, if you didn't tell people what the engine was, and you just made them drive it, they'd think it was a really powerful V8.
Oh, it's just so quick. I mean, that's a quarter stab, give or take, of the throttle. Oh. I love the sound. I just think it's fantastic, and it almost feels amplified. You can just hear so much sound in here.
What I like about it is how everything is immediate in the car. The wing doesn't kind of go up and down.
Yeah.
It slams up and down.
Yeah,
you know? The car.
Yeah, it really does. It just did.
Oh man, and when you go over a bot dot, I call it the rifle crack. You go over a bot dot, and the whole inside of the cabin goes BAM! Because you went over something this
you don't even feel it at an SUV.
And there's no give. There's no give because there is no flex in the body or the suspension. There it is.
Wow! Oh my God! It's just insanely fast. That noise, it's just right behind you, and there's no insulation or anything. It does feel more race car than almost anything. I just drove the Senna. That has a similar feel, because that is also an insane, ridiculous, track focus, storage.
To me, the Senna is extremely cool. It's got a lot of the same characteristics of this car, a lot of philosophy behind it that's very similar to what the philosophy was behind this car.
Right.
But it's almost twice as much by the time you equip it properly.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's just so fast. And it just feels so stable and so good when you're going fast. It just felt so capable, like we were only at a quarter of what it could do, which of course was true. Wow. Man. It's just so good. It just feels so stable and so planted. That's the really impressive thing. It feels like a German or Italian supercar, that company that has been doing this for 100 years, that, is good at that.
I've talked to the guys that were part of the tuning, like the fine tuning. How's the steering feel going to be? What's the throttle going to do? What's going to be like when you start to use the throttle to steer it versus the brakes? And those guys did an amazing job on this car. That's the bottom line. It's really best past its limit.
Yeah.
Now, there are cars that you can drive up to their limit and they're awesome. And what happens past their limit is frightening.
Like it's scary.
And you don't want to do that. But when you push this car past its limit, it is really fun. It's really a fun car, and that's when you know they got it right.
God, it's just incredibly fast. It's also incredibly good slowing down, which I'm not doing I'm not flooring the brake like I am the accelerator, but it's good at it. Clearly you could tell. Yeah, it's really, really tight. Obviously there's virtually no body roll. I'm not even in track mode. Track mode kind of scares me because it just gets so low. But it's just so good. It's so stable. The steering is also very precise, which I love. I hate cars with light steering. I hate cars with light turn-in, especially.
Yes.
And this isn't that. The moment you start to turn it,
something happens.
The car starts to do its thing. And so that's the new Ford GT. This is a bona fide supercar, one of the best on sale today, one of the craziest, fastest cars on the market, period. It's hard to imagine paying $500,000 for a Ford, but it's also hard to imagine that Ford makes a car that'll do almost 220 miles an hour. And yet they do. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I love the look of the Ford GT, but it's more functional than classically beautiful, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration, it's insanely fast, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Handling is tremendously sharp, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Fun factor is excellent, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Cool factor is huge right now. One of these will absolutely stop a Cars and Coffee, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 48 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's reasonably well equipped, but it obviously lacks a lot of luxuries, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is low, the ride is brutal, and the interior is tight, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Quality is excellent, and I suspect it'll be more reliable than a lot of exotic cars, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is very, very, very limited, with virtually no storage space anywhere and a very small interior, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Value is a bit hard to put a number on. This car is going up in value, so it deserves a high score, but it's also tremendously expensive for what it is, especially compared to today's crop of 488 Pistas and GT2 RSs that offer similar numbers for less money. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 70 out of 100, and here's how it compares to some other track-focused exotic cars. You can also see that I've increased the score a bit compared to when I first drove the GT 2 years ago. The GT has an amazingly high weekend score, higher than basically anything, but it also has a really low daily score, lower than basically anything. Truthfully, it was made for 10/10ths driving, and it's not very livable, and that is either awesome or disappointing, depending on your point of view.